Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Essential Implementation. We've got a very special podcast for you today. I spoke to Allison Metz and Laura Damschroder, probably two of the most well-known contributors to the science over the last few decades. They've both been on the podcast before. Great to have them back. This time, I really just asked a very simple question, and we spoke for an hour and a half. It's, what is practical implementation? How can we promote it within our health systems and across the world more?
I just want to say it's an absolute delight to have you both back on. I think if you look at the podcast, it was both of your interviews that got way over 1,000 views. And so you can see that there's a real interest in what you both had to say. You've really guided my work a lot over the years. So I'm really grateful for you coming. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for pulling this together.
The question was, what is practical implementation and how can we promote it within our health systems and across the world more? Have you both sort of had a feeling for a while that although I think we'd probably all agree the science has been extremely useful for defining implementation and finding clever ways to diagnose context, plan for it, evaluate it, barriers and facilitators, but have you both had a feeling for a while that maybe it needs to evolve further if we're going to address the science to practice gap?
So I guess I'll start and the science to practice gap. Kind of taking a step back, the field of implementation science really was started when the the larger research enterprise, NIH in the US, others, in Canada, Europe, Australia, the national level research funding engines or enterprises. They were, of course, funding lots of basic science and clinical trials. And it kind of a big duh. You can't disseminate and get new practices, best practices, new evidence implemented without a lot of effort. It's not enough to just publish in journals. And I know I'm saying what everyone knows because we say this as a preface to all of our papers and all of our talks and discussions and so forth. But I think the important point with this is that the basic origins of implementation science are really kind of a push approach where those of us in implementation science, those of us in the research enterprise, the scientists, the academic, mostly academia, know and see the evidence-based practices that, quote, need to be implemented, everywhere or in these places, et cetera. And so we come to health systems, we come to clinics, and we say, there's this evidence-based practice. Do you want to engage with us in a clinical trial or in an implementation trial? And there are a few factors that really prevent, I think, long-term sustainment and broad use. And one is that even though the practice may be evidence-based, it's evidence-based with respect to whatever the context of the trial itself was. And usually we're trying to squeeze out as many of those nasty contextual factors that get in the way as we can during a trial, or factor them out or control them in some way. And so obviously the evidence may not match the realities of the places, the settings where we're trying to implement them. Secondly, kind of a corollary to that is that health systems, even though they are in place to serve patients and to provide high quality care, the truth is that it's return on investment, it's revenue streams, so we're up against kind of the financial realities that get in the way. And these are things that we as implementation researchers don't really have control over. We haven't worked a lot in the policy arena, in the lobbying arena, to create the conditions that would help us be successful. So what we do is we're working down at the local level, at the microsystem level. We find in our best scenarios, we find champions. We find people who are really like a nurse or a physician, who really want this intervention. They can see how it can help their patients, but then they're swimming upstream because they're working within a system that, again, if those kind of larger financial conditions or other conditions are not met that are typically, again, outside of our boundaries that we can impact, it's a very difficult implementation just to meet short-term goals. And then doing it as a, kind of as a team, more than just what I call the hero model, that even if you meet your short-term goals, meeting your long-term goals, and keeping it sustained so that it's the way we do things around here, is very challenging. It takes, kind of the whole organization to engage. Now, that sounds like a really depressing way to start. And so I think that it's helpful to kind of call the thing. And Allison, you may have other, kind of what I call kiss of death conditions that occur over and over again. But we need to call the thing and call it out so that other people can work on this. There's a lot, I think, that can be done, but we're maybe putting a lot of energy into the wrong places, I guess, in some cases. So what do you think, Allison?
Oh my gosh, Laura, I'm so honored to be in this space with you. I really am. I mean, I just want to say that. I mean, the work you've done is incredible. I think about the consolidated framework for implementation research 1.0 and 2.0, and it's probably the most used framework, and it's for a reason. It's because it embraces and tries to address these levels of contextual factors. So I love the fact that you name these the kiss of death conditions, and also that you name something so critical, which is that most of implementation research is situated at kind of a micro level. It's most of the work that we do when we test out implementation strategies and mechanisms of change is really very, very close to practice. And it's not that that can't be useful, but the big ticket items that lead to sustainability and really critically equitable outcomes are within the outer context, and they have to do with levers around policy and funding and advocacy that implementation researchers are not studying. And I think a lot of that has to do with it's out of implementation researchers' comfort zone. We probably need to kind of think about that too in terms of our research teams and bringing in folks that really specialize in policy research and being able to kind of, bring that into our own teams. So I embrace all of your comments, and I wanted to loop back, Christian, to the question that spurred those great comments, is kind of, when do you notice this disconnect, or how long have you thought about it? And I just wanted to throw out some additional things that I've thought a lot about over the last, maybe I'd say 5 to 7 years. I mean, I think, like a lot of people in the field, I was probably moving along for about a decade, thinking about this good work. So I don't want to indicate that I've had this deep level of self-awareness or thinking about the field in this meta level for a long time. I'd say, maybe about 5 years. The first is when you start to realize that there's a need for what folks might refer to as this kind of second level translation. So that implementation science has these kind of frameworks and theories and models, but they require another level of translation in the form of kind of tools and resources, this idea of kind of practical implementation science for people to actually use them. I know, Laura, you've done a lot of work around technical assistance tools and resources, and just that's new in the field, though, this understanding that needs to happen. The second piece is really thinking about this workforce that we talk about as implementation support practitioners, myself and Bianca Albers, and those of us that have written a lot on this, and sometimes referred to as the unsung heroes. But I think a lot of it's this invisible labor that is not direct practice work, but, you know, back in the interactive systems framework in 2008, there was this kind of nod to the idea that there's this kind of support system that needs to be there. And this group of individuals, myself included, that try and take what we know from implementation science and use it in an embedded way in systems every day, are often not publishing a lot, or are not giving the keynotes, if you will. And I think that that's a real challenge, because I think that there is this workforce that I think is situated in the center of implementation science, because they try and bring together implementation research into actual practice. And I don't think we've talked about them enough. This idea of self-awareness, I think, is really critical in the field. I think there's been a lot of critical analysis in the field around issues of equity, and these issues of some disconnect and between research and practice. And I'm not sure there's enough people in the field of implementation science that are acknowledging how they may have contributed to that. We're kind of, everyone's pointing as to, look what happened. We now have this disconnect. And I think it's really important, you know, that we think about how that might be. So just to give an example, I mean, I probably spent a lot of my career thinking I was highly collaborative. I look back now and I think a lot of work that I did that I thought was collaboration maybe was more extraction from populations that I was working with. And I have to own that, and then realize, how will I correct that, and how do I share my experiences? And I'm not sure we're seeing enough of that. And then the last thing I'll note is the variables. So I've been writing a lot on the concept of trust in implementation and the relational side of implementation. I think that can be done rigorously. I think we can measure things like psychological safety, things like team cohesion, things like trust and alliance in the work, how, you know, how cohesive is the network that we're working with. And I think we need to treat those things as dependent variables. Can we produce greater trust? Can we produce greater team cohesion? Can we produce greater psychological safety in systems that we work in where most people don't feel safe? Fields I work in, like child welfare, families don't feel safe, workers don't feel safe, leaders don't feel safe, but yet we're trying to implement at rocket speed, and people are running for the hills because there's a nervousness in those systems. I think of those things as kiss of death variables. Lack of trust to me is kiss of death. And so that's something else I think adds to this really deep disconnect between implementation researchers and support practitioners, or practitioners, I think, are talking about things that are often referred to as soft, when there's some of the biggest challenges we face. And that drives me a little crazy. But those would be the layers of the disconnect. And so I think they're really similar to Laura, this idea of these kind of kiss of death things that, and I guess I'm extending that to say, I think it's really important that we write about that. I think we're still publishing up a storm in implementation science to other journals on micro level things, and not having researchers talk about all their failures. The CFIR is a phenomenal framework to diagnose failures. You know, you kind of go back and you think, why did this not work? And a lot of it's going to sit at the outer context.
Yeah, Allison, I love the comments that you made when you were talking about the soft stuff, you know, and it kind of, you know, when we say the word soft, we kind of automatically go to, oh, well, that's easy to deal with. You know, it's not hard. But soft means that the boundaries are fuzzy.
Yes.
And soft means that we're, you know, that it's squishy. It doesn't have a discernible shape exactly. It's not something we can see clearly and measure clearly, like, you know, what's the shape of a baseball, you know, kind of thing, and the texture and the weight and so forth. And how do we hit it? You know, how do we hit a home run with it? It's more like a 10,000 pound wet sponge. and we're like going in there and kind of kicking the edges of it, getting our feet wet, and it's not going anywhere. It's just coming right back out to where it was before.
Yes.
But on the heels of that, kind of hopeless, maybe visualization of our work, I do want to agree. One of the things about the CFIR is when we published that, I I thought we were creating something that would be like a quote one-stop shop for constructs, in trying to, and we did have a goal of unifying language or unifying terms and definitions, so that then the next step would be to start to measure those and to have predictive models. And we had all these kind of pie in the sky thoughts, and 20 years later here we are, or 15 years later here we are. But what I didn't appreciate, and now I really appreciate, is just simply it brought a language to the table. And it allows people, when you said that it's a good, it's a good diagnostic tool for even just understanding post efforts, what happened. It gives you the language, it gives people a systematic and uniform way of, and again, I want to acknowledge it's one way of looking at the world. If you're true to any framework or model, they all come to the table giving language and approaches. So, there are many others, of course, that bring that to the table. But I think the CFIR, we really did try to be practical in our language. Although I've been told, Laura, you need to stop being so technical, and I feel like it's just very straightforward. But see, that's me in the middle, and like you were saying, Allison, in self-awareness. Yeah, I thought I was being collaborative, and maybe I had moments of being collaborative. But the other thing I think that we're struggling with in terms of the research enterprise, the larger research enterprise within which we do our work, that I did not mention, are when we get funding, we have a specific timeline and we're usually underfunded. So we don't have time to wait. We just have to make it happen, and we have to find a way to make it happen so that we can meet our goals and get more funding for the next project, which may or may not extend on that earlier work. So we're in, we're out, and or maybe we are, maybe we're not. And when we talk about that, I know in my as well, Allison, I'm your experience in really recognizing the importance of centering the people, both at the micro kind of clinic level, the health system level, and of course the recipients or the patients, the students, the people that we're serving. And I guess I've got two tracks of that we could kind of take for maybe more discussion. One is that the updated version of the CFIR, I think, really does two things. It has a much stronger, I'll call it an invitation to center the people that are doing the work. So the deliverers, it can be teachers, it can be doctors, it can be clerks, it can be housekeepers. And then the recipients, again, they can be citizens of a local town, it can be, patients, students, whatever. And that centering, I hope, which we're nowhere, I think you said the word equity several times, and this is a premium place or a really urgent place where we need to do more work. We have opportunity as implementation researchers and practitioners to address structural racism and structural processes that are in place that serve to further oppress people who are oppressed. And when we're not paying attention, that's what we end up doing, because we take the easy route. But forcing ourselves to look at where are those structures, where are the places that we can address those oppressive structures within and outside the system and the clinics that we're working in. We really need to push ourselves to do that. And that means, and that kind of comes back around again to centering, engaging, including the people who are touched by the work that we're doing. And and then that leads to, I'm really thrilled to see that in more recent years, there's a lot of emphasis or more emphasis on bringing in user-centered design approaches for both physicians and for patients. And Allison, when you were talking about the second level supports that we need, the toolkits, so that these practices that come to the door saying, they need to be implemented, that there would be the tools and the ability for, a champion nurse who really wants to make this happen in her organization, that she's able to pick it up and make it happen. That's a very tall order. And we can say all kinds of things like, well, that's hard because it's different for everybody and it's very complicated, and it really is. But I think we can do a lot better. I've been working, for example, I'm working with one team at Yale who's developing a bundled package. It's a user-centered design of almost the decision aid itself with the implementation strategies and approaches bundled with it. And trying to, within the realm, within the facets of the funded project, to create a bundle that has both implementation and intervention. And where's the line between what's implementation and what's intervention? We would be hard pressed to say exactly where that line is. And I think that it's a good thing, actually, because because then, it's coming to the door, at least with better packaged and easier to implement than what we've been doing traditionally over decades.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, we could definitely spend a lot of time, I think, talking about kind of methods and interdisciplinary work and how helpful that can be, as you noted, about bringing in user-centered design. And but there's so much of that I think we could talk about as a field. Yeah.
And then the second thing is going back to your comments about trust and about teamwork, and the interactive, the dynamic framework. Oh my gosh, for the chambers and
dynamic sustainability framework.
Thank you, dynamic sustainability framework. And in the center of that framework, which we've been really centering our work around in more recent years, and even though it's a high level framework, I love it because it centers those teams and the fact that we need teams to continue optimizing over time. And I in very, very early days, early 2000s of the very earliest days of implementation science, I may misattribute this, but I think it was Carol Estabrooks who talked about, kind of this scale of, we can do, as implementers or researchers, we can do a high level of assistance. She had better words, but basically high level assistance to get things done quicker, like to meet those short-term goals, or a low level of assistance, which is going to take, it's assistance that's following the pace of the people, to the time that it takes to form a team, the time that it takes to build that trust, the time that it takes to understand their own and, do their own self-awareness individually and collectively about what it's going to take to get this change in place. And that does not follow our timeline. We published a paper recently based on work within the VA, where the achieving early implementation goals, those that 6-month goals, which is a common kind of milestone for us in in our funded work, did not necessarily predict future sustainment. Because there were a lot of teams that, they could not get their key people hired within that time, for example. There were things that they needed to get in place, and they did, they got up to a certain point, and what was key is that they kept their commitment, even after we kind of exited stage left in terms of implementation support, but they carried forward. And I don't know exactly what their success ingredients were. There were, of course, it varied depending on the intervention, and this was across a lot of different practices. And those teams that did not make their earlier goals continued actually to sustain. They just implemented late. And then other teams that did make their short-term goals, they kind of fell off, maybe because they kind of forced it through with a single champion who then, had to leave or retired or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. I mean, there's so many things I could say. I'm really enjoying you two just going, just doing this. I did think about complexity science too. That's kind of, if I understand it rightly, is saying that implementation is a complex problem, and so you can't predict what the problems will be till you start. And when we last spoke, Laurie, you mentioned the dynamic sustainability framework, and I think that's so key to addressing that issue, that you need to continually optimize the intervention over time. I think that's probably how you deal with complexity, with the unknown. It's like raising a child. You have to adapt every moment of every day to raise that child. But I also hear everything you're saying about funding and time and timing not being there. We worked with 4 projects recently that were 6-month delayed. The reason being ethics and research governance. Just to get the ethics, delayed everything by 6 months. I mean, that probably is something in the system that needs to be addressed.
That's a whole nother.
I know there's so many things, isn't there?
Can I ask Allison a question?
Please, yeah, carry on.
So Allison, you talked about, how in more recent years, this kind of centering and the importance of kind of trust and psychological safety. Has that changed how have you been able to, so what are you doing differently?
Yeah.
now?
Oh my God, I mean, I think it has. So first, I think it took some time for me to really disentangle the trust piece, because what I realized was that when you're providing the implementation support, you need to develop trust with those you're supporting, right? That feels kind of straightforward. But then there's this other question, which is, can you also foster trusting relationships among those that you're supporting, which became like a particular interest in just some of these service contexts. Like I noted how kind of some service settings like child welfare inherently feel a lack of safety, and there can be a distrust in those systems, and I think in many systems. And then also, again, these kind of contextual variables, when you're working to try and scale something, for example, those private service providers compete for dollars in the public system, but yet they're supposed to come together for this big initiative and share what their challenges are. I mean, of course, that's hard to do, right? So when you're trying to support learning in an implementation effort where there's a slight, or even large level of distrust or not wanting to share, it can be really hard. So I guess two things that I can say. One, from a research perspective, we're just finishing up a study now funded by the William T. Grant Foundation in a child welfare system that is doing statewide scale up of an evidence-based model for children in out-of-home placement. And we developed a trust building approach. So with all the implementation team meetings, we had basically a curriculum and coaching that came very transparently to support building trusting relationships. And so we're doing it very explicitly as part of our work. And we share coming in all of these things, like why it is that this might not feel like the safest environment. Totally get that. Here's why we think that here's some things we're going to do. And how do we kind of demonstrate vulnerability? And I always say with that, not that we're sharing our personal details, but how do we enter into this space acknowledging things we don't know? Or, how can we be helpful? The results from that are really good. We had a strong theory of change, or a very detailed one, that basically predicted that if we could enhance levels of psychological safety and trust on these regional teams that we were working with, that would lead to some of those behavior changes. We'd want to see greater motivation, commitment to the work. And we're seeing that, and we're seeing a deeper commitment to transparently doing learning and looking at data together, which is really great. But the second way I think that we've kind of changed our work is really embracing like systems theory, kind of coming into it, systems models, the idea that have been around forever by folks, concepts of like the iceberg model. What can we see? What can't we see? What's below the waterline? And so we're doing a lot of work around values-driven implementation. So how do we basically come at this by trying to develop some shared mental models coming into the work? And how do we routinize values reflection in every implementation team meeting? So we have team meetings, and it's built in where at the end of team meetings, we might talk about, like, say your values are, this is going to be family-led, equity-focused, evidence-driven, those kinds of things. The end of the meeting, we kind of think about what actions have we taken, what resources do we plan to allocate, what decisions were made in this meeting, and are they reflective of these values? And it's funny, in the projects that we've had, there was a lot of resistance to that in the beginning. It took too much time. It was too soft, like we don't, and we have gotten to a point where in one of our projects have been doing that for almost 2 years. And it completely changed strategies that were used, because they started to realize that family-led wasn't really playing out as family-led. And it was a large place-based initiative funded by a couple large foundations. And so those are just ways of trying to kind of, through research, but also through the way we take a step back in the work. And as we create teams, yes, we're building capacity for data use. We're doing all those technical things that you do on a team. What are our milestones and benchmarks as we move through these stages of implementation? What will success look like to us? How will we measure it? But it's also, are we a team? Are we a functioning, cohesive team? Because we all know from the literature, when people trust each other, they innovate, they learn. And I think back, 2009, Laura, that great sentence in the original article that like formal time for debriefing and reflection is a key part of implementation. That sentence in, I think it's the original CFIR article, is guided my career in the sense, because it took something that, again, feels soft, the concepts of reflection, and said, no. So what I've tried to do is in all team meetings, try and build the muscle around reflection, not just on the work we can see, but what we can't see. Because we all sit in implementation team meetings where no one's talking, or people seem annoyed, or people are multitasking, and you're like, oh, I thought we all agreed on this, but someone just left the meeting and they didn't come back, and I'm not sure, and someone didn't show up to the last 2 meetings. And it's like, I think that's the stuff that is where that disconnect happens that we talked about earlier. I think that people don't realize what a big part of the job that is to figure that out, and to relationally switch, and to try and do that. I don't know if that's answering your, but those are just some examples.
I love that. I'm so excited about what you said, Allison. I'm 1000% behind your approach. That is fantastic, and I can't wait to whatever you published or will publish. Please send me a link.
Absolutely will. I will. Yeah. Yeah. We have a couple articles out now that I'll send you.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm hoping to continue to get more out. Yeah. I was just saying that to Christian, time for writing, but Yeah, and it can be rigorous too. It can continue to build the science. It's just also the transdisciplinary, which is just more than switching out our methods. It's bringing in, what do we know from psychology?
Yeah.
You know, what do we know from anthropology? What do we know from political science? Because what we know is we're dealing with people that have emotions, that have biases, that have assumptions, that bring a set of values to the work. And if we ignore that, those I think are big challenges. And so many of us know better. Like, I'm a trained psychologist, right? I mean, of course, when I'm in a meeting, it's like group dynamics are at play, right?
Yeah.
Positionality, authority, power. Of course, you should be diagnosing those things, at least in your mind, and we shouldn't put them over here and just kind of complain about them.
Mm-hmm.
We should be thinking about, just as there's the compilation, these taxonomies of strategies, we should be adding to those strategies, because so many of us were trained in adjacent fields, which are very people-centered, and we should know how to address some of those challenges when we're dealing with groups.
Absolutely. And we brought in Amy Edmondson's work in teaming,
yes.
more in the updated CFIR, even more. I love your phrase, building the muscle of reflection.
Yeah.
And, this is a skill that, like you said, it's not necessarily valued because it's not directly producing, revenue or,
Right.
kind of hard
Right.
metrics necessarily. And yet, not only is it building trust, it sounds like, and functioning teams, but I also, my theory about this too is that it can impact and improve the pervasive burnout that we're seeing, especially coming out of COVID. And I really believe that there is a strong connection between, burnout, moral injury. I think that people are feeling in the care field, but not able to do what they're trained to do because of so many different constraints on the system and their work setting. But being able to work as a team together and building that trust, building psychological safety. And psychological safety, for people just who are not familiar with that term, is creating a receptive environment and for failure as well as success. And that, no question is a stupid question. That if you're at a table with 10 people, you are not afraid to voice your questions, to voice your concerns, mistakes, and that leaders also exhibit these behaviors. And it's really important for leaders to do that. But at least at the micro level, even at the frontline level, building teams like you're doing, Allison, can create a protected sphere, even within an environment that may be toxic or maybe, not great. There are ways. I firmly believe, not that it's easy, but I think that there are ways that we as individuals, regardless of where we work within the organization, we have spheres of influence. We have spheres of, maybe smaller than we'd like, spheres of control. But to recognize what those spheres are and to build those relationships with other people that can positively contribute to the work. And working in a team environment like this, then people don't feel like they're alone. People don't feel like they have to shoulder the burden and it's all up to them and no one else cares and I'm the only one who cares. No, imagine going to work and you have, let's say even just 4 people, that are of like mind, that you trust, that you can walk into their space, close the door, or go outside for a while, whatever, and have a conversation. That those are that it's like a light in your work. And I think that in a lot of settings, people are so pushed and maxed out to produce that really, I think part of what we're seeing is I'd like to think that the pendulum is and will be swinging the other way, because, it's kind of like systems have been wringing out as much energy and production from humans as possible within the health setting, like, seeing how many patients per day, as a met or as a goal, as a push. I think that, people have been pushed to the limits, and that it's time, past time, I think, building those relationships. It allows, two people to be more than two people, to be more than the sum of the parts. And I feel like this is what we're lacking in a lot of the settings that I've, worked in over time, is, again, that people are working in silos and they feel isolated. And these approaches, I mean, you said you were working with these teams for 2 years. And some of I love this, I put it as, bringing, data is your friend. Data is your friend, and building a relationship even with data, as well as your coworkers. And it really is a revelation. We published a paper, I guess it was last year, beginning of this year, that just kind of illustrated one team's experience after they went through our LEAP program for quality improvement coaching. It's a kind of a virtual coaching for quality improvement to bring teams through one cycle of change, plan, do, study, act, cycle of change. And this team really was kind of a positive deviant in the sense that they really embraced this way of working. They were able to create and retain a team, even though people were coming in and out, but they were integrated into their, kind of team, and they continued to work on improvement goals. And when you were talking about, we need to hear from these practitioners, we need to hear, what they learned so that we can learn from them. It's hard for them to publish because they don't have the time or the capacity or the confidence, and being able to necessarily write about their experience. They're authors on the paper. They contributed significant content. We really wanted them to lead or be a lead author, and we would, help them and give them confidence. And they were eager, I think, for people to hear the work that they've done, and they're very proud of what they've done, but they're also, very hesitant to lead the writing in this way. I mean, they're not trained, to do that. But I just wonder if there are other outlets too for, besides scientific journals. On the other hand, we, the scientists, need to hear the experiences. Yeah.
Laura, I mean, I feel like you must be like one in a million in this like field, in the sense that you would author the CFIR, 2 rounds of it, be this incredible scientist, and also be so deeply in touch with the humanity that surrounds implementation work. Because, like, just as you talked about burnout, I mean, I think about like COVID, and I think for me afterwards, I mean, I think there's a lot of practitioners with PTSD who work in healthcare settings and other, and I also, when we were at the Limerick conference, we talked about, and this idea has been around for a while, like for really decades, but the concept of trauma, but the idea of traumatized systems that are deeply under-resourced, where their practitioners are engaged in activities where they can have secondary trauma. And that does bother me a bit in the field, in the field of implementation science, that there's not a lot of attention. It feels like a bit adjacent, the literature around how you work in systems that practitioners have experienced trauma, where the organizations themselves may demonstrate signs of kind of organizational trauma. And what does that mean for implementation leadership? But I just wanted to say that there's like a humanity to this, that at least in COVID, I think one of the things that happened is it shone a light on how hard these systems were even before COVID. the amounts of turnover that were happening, and as you said, the moral injury that practitioners often experience in many of these service settings. And I feel like there's just not enough in the literature in the big IS journals or at the conferences talking about these issues of burnout and secondary trauma in these systems. So I just wanted to say how moved I was that you brought that up, because I just don't, again, think it's discussed nearly enough in our strategies that we're using. And then this idea of psychological safety, how incredible to have engaged with Amy Edmondson, you know, obviously kind of the big kind of field leader in this area. But if we want to center those with the biggest stake in implementation in the work, often we're talking about individuals with lived experience. And I just did a presentation for parents with lived experience in a child welfare system who are now working in the system and supporting the work on the concept of psychological safety on the teams that they were working with. And it was so emotionally moving and triggering, I think, for a lot of folks who may have been hired and included, but yet somehow don't feel safe to contribute, safe to challenge, safe to learn, you know, all those kinds of stages of psychological safety. So I think if we are, as a field, going to embrace more participatory work, then we 100% have to be thinking about what that means for the teams we're working on. And that means that those of us in the field of IS have to skill up individually on the strategies to promote psych safety. And we have to be able to measure it, because we could end up doing more harm by bringing people in on teams and them not feeling safe on the team. You know what I mean? So I just wanted to say our own methods have to shift if we are going to authentically be participatory. So those were just some thoughts.
100% agree. I wanted to go back and touch on when you were talking about the values, and that, you know, teams to identify the values that kind of drive their work, and whether it's, you know, family led and equity and so forth. You know, first of all, to translate those kind of high level values into concrete metrics, you know, so that they can see their level of progress, and to and not just like this abstract idea of level of progress, but also so they can celebrate their successes, and identifying successes that can be had quickly and easily, to help, bring motivation, excitement, capacity, I guess, and confidence for people, for teams working together. But I think another really important thing is, and we brought this out in our outcomes addendum paper that preceded the updated CFIR, and that is recognizing that within every system, there are going to be conflicting goals, conflicting outcome expectations, and whether you want to call it, you know, values or what. But now I'm going to be a little bit, you know, cynical here of the world, but, you know, the biggest one for me is at the front line, recognizing what the executive leaders have to be focusing on.
Yeah.
A lot of times they're focused on, you know, the political sphere, for sure the shareholder, you know, within the US, more so than other countries, the shareholder perspective, the investor's perspective, even if they're nonprofit, and absolute, you know, need in their sphere to show revenue, to show growth, to show return on investment. And, you know, especially in systems where the resources are so scarce. I mean, you're talking about trauma at the system level. You know, there are leaders also that are experiencing this, and, you know, and they're kind of at the edge, at the edge, basically, of having to serve all of these external expectations, while all the while being, you know, at some level motivated, engaged, and wanting to serve patients and be the very best that they can be. but they're also recognizing that tension and their inability maybe, and that's where, you know, some of that trauma and psychs and you know, burnout can come at that level as well. And then at the front line, yes, you know, again, all these constituencies want to do the very best for serving patients. But, you know, again, at the front line, just the reality of if I can go home and not have to spend 2 hours documenting my patients after my kids go to bed, that would be, you know, huge. And so recognizing that, you know, there's way too much work being taken home within a setting, and then setting a goal to reduce that amount of workload, that doesn't have, on the surface, it doesn't have anything to do with the patients they're serving. And yet, if that goal is integrated, or it may be important and absolutely essential to integrate that goal, because, you know, again, people are already stretched thin and they don't have absorptive capacity for change. So how can we make their work lives immediately better through the work that we're doing? And then, of course, the third constituent are the patients or the students or the families that we're serving, and what are their goals? And sure, they may want to, what's an example of like an outcome in your grants that you have that are at the kind of the family level?
Sure. So, I mean, it could just be kind of, yeah, greater protective factors for a family. So family cohesion. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so those are important measures, but they may not really mean anything for the families themselves.
Exactly.
And so, or, you know, like in hypertension, you know, are people taking their medications? Are they having fewer cardiac events? Well, I, as a patient, as a hypertension patient, I don't appreciate that I avoided a cardiac event. I just assume that I'm going to, you know, whether or not I take my medication, I'm not counting on having a cardiac event. But what's important to me is, you know, if I take a pill, I immediately feel better.
Feel better.
Or
yes.
I know I should take my pills. What's an easier way I can do it? How do we integrate it with the 11 other medications that I'm taking? Instead of, you know, making my life more complicated. So just kind of these very human, you know, goals, and recognizing that, you know, are there more tangible, I guess, wins that we can create or, you know, address, you know, through those, especially those three key constituencies. And like when you're working with teams, for them to recognize and have empathy even for their executive leaders that are having to address and navigate all of these external forces, you know, that their lives, their work lives are completely different than down at the front line. It's yeah, anyway, that's, you know, kind of part of the awareness.
Total sense. And we
Yeah.
have to have that level of empathy at multiple levels. Like if you're having a meeting with a commissioner, it's a different conversation. And I think part of our job is to kind of like the trust building is to enhance empathy for like a leadership level for folks on the team, to enhance empathy for folks on the team for the leadership. Like it's this idea of how are we an instrument of empathy building, you know, by ensuring, like, as we're kind of having these meetings, running teams, that we're just almost noting, well, of course, this is going to be really hard for leadership because they have all these constituents and timelines and funders, and so their backs against the wall. Like, so we have to think about that as we kind of, you know, so sometimes I approach it that way, right? I just kind of bring in that perspective as if, well, we all know this. So, you know what I mean? Or if I'm talking to a leader, like I'll say something like, well, you know how hard it is. I'm sure you're thinking about how hard it is for everybody.
Yeah.
And, you know, always try to kind of like get everyone to kind of see each other's perspective. Yeah.
Never forget one project we worked on. This was a good 10 years ago, and it was just so memorable. And the contrast between different settings, different hospitals that we were working with. And there was one hospital where you know, of course, we were bringing in an intervention and, you know, looking for teams to implement. And they were, this was an infection prevention intervention in hospitals. And for most of the hospitals that we talked to, they were either, already doing kind of edges of it, or they were really enthusiastic, or, they were really struggling, but they saw this as a completely, new, isolated, new change initiative. And either they were able to embrace it, they had the absorptive capacity to do it, or they didn't. And so a lot of the hospitals were really struggling. This is great, but we're doing XYZ also, and and variable levels of failure or success. There was one hospital, however, who had a level of middle management that really acted as a buffer or a translator between the executive level and the front line.
Yeah.
And with this initiative that we were doing, there was a manager, or I don't want to just point to one person, but I know that she was working with a team of other managers, that they were able to align what the goals were that we were trying to implement with these two other initiatives that were related, not quite the same. And this is the frustration that people have too, right? Oh, it's the flavor of the month. It's just going to go away. I'm going to put my head down and get ready for this to be done. And if it sticks around in another year, then maybe I'll think about, doing it. Then I'll know that, people are serious about it around here. Because it's, this change and that change and moving on to the next thing before people are ready. But if you can align a change initiative with already articulated, other changes that are happening, then they can reinforce each other instead of competing or having the perception of competing with each other. That's just another.
No, that's such a good example. Really is.
I just wanted to say, just to kind of summarize, really, you've got these huge systems that are very complex and very stretched, and you've got multiple stakeholders, right from the patient, the person receiving treatment or care, all the way up to exec level. They all have different needs, different pressures. As you were saying, Laura, some of them will be burnt out. Some of them might even have PTSD. I've seen that too with nurses on an ICU ward over COVID. And we're talking about, and I can understand this, that from my own experiences, when you don't really know someone, this person does the economic evaluation, this person's the middle manager. When you don't really know that person, you've not had shown any vulnerability with them, I guess, any real conversations, real humanness with them, it does feel like, everyone's trying to just get what they need, and I need to get what I need. And I can appreciate how when you bring those people together and you really do work, and it's taken you, Alice, I'm saying 2 years, but if you do that, I can see exactly how the motivation and the focus stops being, I need to just think about me, to something bigger, something collective. So I guess my question would be, do you think it's possible to get, a patient, practitioner, probably a practice lead, manager, exec, all in the same room, and actually create a team with those people? Do you think that's possible? Or is it like you were saying, Laura, about maybe it's more of an intermediary, somebody just, I think you were, Allison, too, about just somebody playing that role of intermediary?
Well, I'll say one thing, that leadership engagement, that construct, or the engagement of high level and mid level, supervisory and so forth, the middle level management, which Sarah Birkin has done, published articles on, and highlighting the importance of middle management in this, because they're they're a really key important layer within organizations, but we don't often pay a lot of attention to them. But I will say that, the engagement and the level of support and the type of support shown by executives and middle management is a really key factor that comes out again and again as either a point of success, determinant of success, or a determinant of failure. So those are yes, leadership is extremely important to engage. And I think, maybe Allison, you could say a little bit more, too, about the teams and their connections up through the, kind of the hierarchy of the organization.
Yeah, I think it's probably Christian. I mean, I think like it's two ways. Like this idea of, as Laura's saying, I mean, you can the way we develop teaming structures, yes, we can have intermediaries or implementation support practitioners that are kind of helping to broker the connections between those different levels in a system. And that would be a very key role that I think someone providing implementation support should be doing. But it is also the way you set up the teams and ensuring that every team has access to leaders and decision makers on another team or at an executive leadership level. And that's something that we always come in as basically part of an implementation support kind of almost like requirement, is that we need to make sure as we build a team, we're always checking with executive leadership. If they're not on the team, have they delegated decision-making authority to a team? Or does that team have timely access to those who can make decisions, and will they engage? But this other question about, can you bring together like a patient, a practitioner, a manager? I think you can. I mean, we have this this exercise that comes from relational leadership training. It's called a one-to-one, and like I'm happy to share that with you guys. And it's in we have a certificate program in implementation practice, and it's one of the favorite things people learn how to do, and it feels so simple. But it's you bring people on a team and you have them go into basically, they can be in pairs or trios. And this is something that could take as little as like 6 minutes. And there's one person asks another person a question. So in the example you just gave, Christian, the question could be something like, why did you accept the invitation to be on this team? And this person answers the question, and the person listening has to be basically it's teaching that skill of listening for understanding rather than listening to respond. Most of us, are listening to respond a lot. Hopefully Laura and I are doing a good job for listening for understanding today. I think we are, but the idea that you're often listening just to be able to speak, to wait your turn to say something. And so one of the ways that we do this is that they have to be listening for a value that they hear in the person's response. And when they think they hear a value, they have to engage on it and say, I heard this value, and that value comes up for me in my life sometimes too. And right. So anyway, and then so if it's in trios, there's a third person that spends about a minute kind of observing the connection. So anyway, we did this on a team that had like youth, like who aged out of care, like a very mix of people, practitioners, managers. And we came back and someone said to me, that exercise can unstick a stuck team. Because what it did in a very powerful 4-6 minutes, if you basically give people the container that they're listening to understand a value, not listening to say something, they have to then connect on that value. They all leave after that 6 minutes or so. Oh, we all have some shared values here. This is really interesting. So anyway, I just wanted to say that's a strategy, right? That's an intervention that we use in implementation team meetings. It doesn't take up the whole 90-minute meeting because we have data to look at or other things to do. But we may, over the course of 2 or 3 months, make sure that everybody gets 3 minutes with someone else. And then over time, it kind of builds this sense of shared values. So anyway, I just want to give that as like a really practical tip to anyone that listens, that watches this.
That's an awesome strategy. I'm reminded of motivational interviewing and, kind of the active listening skill, but the fact that you've got a specific, kind of ask in this conversation or in the exercise to listen for a value. That's really cool. And then the person, speaking, I'm thinking of like the youth who participated, they can feel seen by adults.
Yeah.
And,
yes.
So for anyone who feels like, oh, I don't really have anything important to say, or I'm afraid to speak up, having that opportunity to be heard and to be seen is tremendous. Wow,
Yeah.
I love that.
It's
The
great.
CFIR, the updated CFIR, we have that construct that we call relational connections. And,
Yes.
you're really talking about trying to break down silos and create what we call boundary spanning, and create those connections. And they're so important, building those relational connections. And I don't think it's something that we naturally see as being our job, as implementers. We need to just, meet these goals, get X, Y, and Z done, and, do these strategies and so forth. But
Yeah.
building relationships, that's, and how equipped do we feel to do that? So there's, kind of our own personal work too that we need to do.
100%. Yep.
It is. I think there's more and more being written on that in kind of our work, but also of course around implementation facilitation and the amount kind of written on that. But the idea of, role, what is our role in this work, and what difference, can we make? And I think that's so important. And I mean, it actually kind of goes back to Laura comments you were making quite a while ago. And I was thinking about this concept of role and how important it is for us to, yes, be really self-aware of our role and what we can contribute. There's this like game or technique in liberating structures called the 15%. And it's the idea that 85% of things feel out of our control in these large systems we work in. And the goal is when you're working with anyone in those systems, including ourselves, by the way, like I feel like I've definitely had, I don't know, officially burnout, but fatigue. Someone said to me, if you feel tired on a Monday, that is not a good sign. And you're kind of, and during COVID, I definitely felt that on Mondays. I still felt really fatigued. And so, those are things I think about, but what I'm always trying to figure out is what is my 15%? Where can I make a difference? And it's an exercise I do a lot with teams who feel really at a loss, because there's just been budgetary shifts or leadership turnover, whatever it is, and people are pulling out their hair. And I think it's really important to kind of think about where can we make a contribution, and whether that's just in making people feel okay about what they do. Like sometimes I believe my job when I come into a team meeting is just people feel better about their jobs. Sometimes we make a lot of progress on implementation, but it's like I have to kind of figure out where can I make a difference? What's my 15%? And I think that as it relates to bigger issues too, in that outer context, around issues around power and injustice and equity, so much of that can feel really overwhelming, but you have to think in role, what can I do here? What are the 3 things that I can take action on? What are the 3 questions I can consistently ask till someone answers me? Do you know what I mean? And not just ask it once and no one really answers me and I let it go, but what are the 3 things I can keep asking, the 3 things I can keep doing? And so I don't know how I got on this tangent, but I think it's really helpful that in role, we think about that, whether we're on the research side or the practice side, but our entire job should be to make a positive difference, so we have to just constantly ask ourselves, how are we going to do that today?
Yeah. And the extent to which you're able to, and you do that within yourself, coming to the table as a so-called expert. You actually are an expert, but people will perceive you as an expert, and that's kind of an automatic power balance there, or power dynamic there with any of the teams that you're working with. But the extent to which you're doing that kind of self-work, that personal work, that sets you up for being able to coach teams and to bring teams through that process likewise.
Yeah, 100%. And Christian, another thing I just wanted to say about the complexity science. One small way I try and bring that into kind of my work and is just always asking the question that complexity people will kind of tell us to ask, right? Because once you move one little domino, everything kind of moves around, is what are the intended and unintended consequences of what are we doing? Like, I think we have to keep asking ourselves, boy, 3 months has passed. What would have been some unintended consequences, some of which could be good, some of which could be not good, you know? And so I think it's like we sometimes stay on with our logic models or whatever it is, our implementation plans, and we're following them along and we're looking, are we achieving this? Are we achieving this benchmark that we set forth at the beginning? But I think we have to constantly, from a complexity perspective, be asking ourselves about unintended consequences. And then from a self-awareness perspective, I think I need to constantly remind myself, I know very little about complexity science. I mean, I know just enough to say what I said. I've read some articles on it, but I said in Limerick in that panel discussion, I encourage implementation scientists to go to conferences outside of their field, like, because complexity is its own thing. There are conferences on that. And if we all went to those, we would realize how little we know about complexity work. And so I think, or user-centered design, I know just enough about that to know that it's helpful. Again, I've read some articles on it. I could probably talk about it for 5 or 10 minutes, and that would be about it. And there's people that have built their careers around that. And so I guess it's also understanding what we don't know, and we don't need to know everything. We need to know what we don't know, figure out if we do want to know it, or if we just want to bring people in our teams that are experts at that, because we can't all be experts at everything,
Right. And I want to bring out their sustainability science, and they probably have their own conferences as well.
I didn't know about that. That's amazing.
Yeah. So, I've called implementation science a mutt science in the sense that, and mutts are really cute. And so I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean that in terms of we're blending a lot of different disciplines, and that's part of, we're working in a very complex sphere, because we as implementation scientists as a principle embrace complexity, and we're trying to understand all of these factors. We need to, of course, we try to control them and do what we can in order to accomplish our goals. But really, on our good days, we recognize the complexity and we embrace it. And it's dynamic, and it's hard, but it's also exciting and inspiring. We need to bring in, it's like we're breaking down the scientific silos, because we're not afraid, and really we need to go out to people in business schools. Amy Edmondson is in a business school, psychology, of course, and sociology, as well as sustainability and complexity. And I think that this sphere that we're operating in is so much fun because, well, for one thing, we're working in the real world and, really trying to make a difference, where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. But we also, we have the freedom to bring in these other disciplines, these other ways of looking at the world and integrating it in a positive way.
100%. Yeah.
This has been amazing, really. Also, I like how you brought in some practical examples, because that's what people are really craving for at the moment, and the systems I'm working in, you can talk about like a lot of things like relating and working with other disciplines. But when you gave that practical example, Allison, that people are going to love that, because it's something they can use tomorrow or today. They can take that exam and go and use it. And that's what I think we need to try and do as scientists, to try to let people know about these things, pragmatic, practical ways you can research implementation, but also facilitate and support it, also empower individuals. Like, I'm totally with you, Laura, on that. Ever since our first podcast, I've just been always thinking, how can we empower the staff in the healthcare system so they're not burnt out? We've got a lot of people leaving at the moment, and so I'm really arguing a strong case that we need to be doing research that supports them and the patients, of course, and everybody, and they need to have a say on what that research is.
Well, I just want to say that, when the conditions in systems begin to hit the bottom line in tangible ways that executive leaders and policymakers can see, then we can really hope for change for the better. So some dynamics that I know that all systems are really struggling with is the high rate of turnover. You know, that people are, and I will say anecdotally that the younger kind of freshly trained early career people, they're coming in and saying, I want to work 4 days a week. And when I go home, I'm home and I'm not you know, I'm going to work 30 hours, 40 hours, and that's it. And I don't know if you've had that experience, Allison, but you know, that this is the reality of recruiting for all of those people who are leaving the system and leaving even their profession. And so, you know, this to me, this is a diagnostic of what has been happening in the last, I don't know, 50 years in, you know, just the workspace. Well, probably actually longer than that, but you know, within healthcare. And I think that, you know, the good thing about this is that leaders and systems are going to have to pay attention. They're going to have to care for. I love the triple aim. You know, that now it's the quadruple aim to include care for physicians, care for you know, the people within the health system. I extend it beyond physicians and into everyone, you know, working within the health system, because if employees are happy, then that will ripple out to the patients, to the people that they serve. And so it's an important stance to have.
I think it's like, Laura, this coming back to this outer context issue and like just workforce generally. And so again, I think COVID kind of shone this light, and we discussed that a lot of this had been happening before COVID. You know, turnover rates and many systems can be as much as 60% a year for really direct service staff. But I think what you're saying is even bigger, because as we move into kind of a post-pandemic world, and large cities that I've always worked in who may have always had turnover in their systems, what they didn't have a problem with was recruitment. There was always people that could come in. These same systems are, for the very first time in their history in many ways, because they're in these kind of large urban environments and didn't maybe have some of the challenges that more rural areas did, that they cannot recruit. And they can't recruit because of what is not just a post-pandemic world of people wanting to be hybrid and maybe not wanting to do a lot of home-based work or whatever it is, but it is what you're saying. It's work-life balance. It's the 4-day work week. And I think that this is shifting so much that we are going to see in the next 10 years a different workforce in these systems. And I think improvement science will become really critical for creating efficiencies, because we're not going to have people that maybe are saying, I don't mind working 60 hours a week. Like, that's fine. And it's okay that I'm underpaid. I'll still work 60 hours a week. Like, I don't know if we have a generation coming up that will tolerate that. And we can analyze that like to no end as to why that is. But it comes back to the implementation researchers needing to, an evidence-based developer of models. We need to be developing interventions and choosing implementation strategies that are feasible to implement. I mean, these so much requires so many bells and whistles, and the turnover, it's just impossible to keep a workforce trained in a lot of the sophisticated intervention. Like, it just is like, that's, you know, we can't do that. We have to kind of rethink that, right? And so I think the field of IAS should be a partner with other kind of fields and the settings we're working in to rethink what it means to support people to just do the best they can do. You know, like, it's just, yeah, I hate to talk about like lowering expectations because that feels really negative, but I think in some ways, I think it's more aligning expectations with what's feasible in these systems. Because I think pre-COVID, we were pie in the sky with a lot of, we were coming into systems and saying, let's use these 6 models that require everyone to be, in 3 months of training, and we know you'll lose revenue when they're not patients, but they need to do this. And I know 60% of them will turn over next year. You know what I mean? Like, this stuff was kind of crazy making, after a while. And I think it leads to everyone's burnout who works on the ground in implementation as to how silly some of this really was that we were attempting to do. So one of maybe the silver linings or blessings of COVID in the midst of all of the injustice and horrible outcomes was maybe lifting up the fact that these systems need something else from us.
Yeah, and I think that, going back to your work and then, our work as well, just imagine if the way of working within health systems, within social support systems, was having improvement teams and not only focused on efficiency, but I think a collateral outcome for having improvement teams that are just a part of the way we work is that people who are engaged in improvement are empowered. And, we as human beings, we have an innate desire to make things better. And whether it's better in terms of efficiency, whether it's better in terms of, quality, we want to be engaged in making things better for ourselves, for our coworkers, for the people we serve. That's an innate characteristic of non-traumatized human beings. And just imagine if we had a system, and the forces working against that are just tremendous right now. So focused on throughput. And I'll never forget, there was an article about the VA, griping on the fact that primary care physicians were spending X number of hours not giving patient care, quote unquote administrative work. And they were just, horrified. This is a waste of taxpayer dollars. But how do you make patient care better? How do you, address, kind of the setting level characteristics? How do you continue to learn as a practitioner if you don't have the time and space to do that? Those hours outside of direct patient care are, pay tremendous dividends. Within the VA, at least, we don't have quite the pressures that systems outside the VA have. The pressure on throughput and so forth. But those are the big forces. And I think getting back to what you were saying, Allison, is that, the people are speaking up basically with their feet and with their decisions. And there is a reckoning that needs to occur or is occurring. And,
Yes.
and hopefully, can result in just a different way to work that is more empowering, more less dehumanizing. And again, back on those squishy, soft relational connections.
Yeah.
which are the engine. I mean, it's the engine for working in the world, really.
Yeah. I did a podcast with 4 frontline doctors, but yeah, they were saying that they were, just sick of getting like free bags and free mugs. They'd rather have time to go to the toilet. And one piece of work our places I work at is doing is taking Maslow's hierarchy of needs into these settings and trying to get everyone to remember what basic human needs are, and that, unless those are met, people will leave. It needs to be a nice place to work. So it is very important, this kind of work right now. And it's wonderful to hear you both talk about it in such detail and articulate it so well.
Are you feeling positive or negative after all this? Is there?
I'm feeling I've got to say, I'm feeling super positive, because the look, firstly, everybody's screaming for something else. So the demand is there, right? It's like, and whether it's patients, whether it's practitioners, whether it's researchers, they're all wanting to know, even funders, we're all getting a bit tired of this circular thing where we put all this money into something, we don't really get the outcomes, and then we start again. People actually want to have impact. So that's good. I think today, you both have really gone in detail into how, we need to draw, well, firstly, we need to engage all stakeholders. We need to create trust and safety, and we need to draw from multiple sciences if we're going to solve this extremely complex problem. And that's what you've both done. And so I think the next thing is that people like Allison and Laura, maybe you could spend some time on this too, if come out of retirement and help us out, is actually providing the training in pragmatic physical examples of what those people can do. You know what I mean? Whether it's people who just want help, whether it's the people you've worked with to develop new solutions, but just like Allison, your example of the 15%, 85%, that just helped me, to be honest, because I'm someone who, goes in, thinks I've got to change everything, I've got to fix everything. And actually that's not good for me, and there's lots of people like me. We're always efforting, always pushing. And actually it's good to have a tool like that, to think, no, I can only affect 15%. So if I remember that, and what's my role, that helps. So yeah. So engaging, training, multiple sciences, and then training, helping.
Yeah, I mean, and we have this certificate program in implementation practice and through the School of Social Work at UNC, and that has been a total joy, because the people that go through it we've just done one cohort, we have 2 more cohorts coming up, but are kind of managers and leaders of systems. And some of them will be people that kind of are situated in the world of IS. Like we had some academics, some couple like postdocs, like some people who might associate as a support practitioner. But the vast majority of people that are registering are people that work in systems, who run teams, who, are the champions, and it's exactly right. They love 2 things, I think, in the certificate program, those kinds of tools. Both like the 1-to-1 and the 15% are in there. They're kind of brought in like, around bigger issues on teams or that kind of thing. But they also, getting back to that burnout piece, they love the opportunity to talk with other folks that are experiencing all the same challenges, like creating this space for the people that work in what I think of as like the space in between. It's like people who maybe aren't implementation researchers, but aren't direct practitioners either, but are in this space where they're supporting implementation to happen. And that work is invisible by a lot of folks. And so, kind of making that more visible feels like how I want to charge on in career. But this was helpful for me, Laura. I mean, as I said, I think you're 1 in a million, so I don't know, like it makes me feel hopeful to hear you talk, like, to be honest, like just knowing that you're this incredible researcher and scientist, but have such a deep understanding of the relational aspect of the work is just so refreshing. Because honestly, I don't think you see it that much, that combination.
I'm back at you, Allison. You're 1 in a million as well. And I think that the work you're doing is so important. And like Christian said, I think it's, it's great for people like me to kind of pontificate at the high level and, maybe diagnose things. But I just feel like you and your team and your work have such a gift and focus on making it practical. And these tools, I'm with Christian. I'd like to hear more about the Liberator, 15%. Yeah. I love that conversation thing. If there's a tool,
I'll send you guys that. I'll send you an example of the tool.
And it's very exciting to hear about your certificate program, and the level of enthusiasm and participation in that is really cool. And, I was thinking that it would be really wonderful if you did like the little 6-minute, one-on-ones with the people coming into the certificate course.
Yeah, they do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that's, I mean, just even to hear like why are they so enthusiastic about wanting to spend time in this certificate program, and what do they hope?
I'll send you the one that we use for them, because it essentially gets them to feel more connected to the small groups that they're in for the 6 days, and then they're then yeah, and if it also models for them what it would be
Yeah.
if they wanted to use it with the team. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I have a 10 a.m., so I'm a couple minutes late, so
Yes.
I probably have to hop off.
Well, I just say thanks so much for coming, Allison. Yes, we will see you again.
Laura, so good to see you. I'll talk to you
Likewise,
later.
Allison.
Thanks,
Have a
Christian.
wonderful week.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
And it was fun for me to get to interact with Allison too. I like
Yeah.
this format here. Yeah.
Great.
All right. Thank you,
Okay.
Christian.
See you later,
have a
Laura.
good week and good luck with everything.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.